Hi everyone, welcome to week 8. This week we're focusing on environmental problems, and the reading for this week is chapter 5 from the Wright textbook. And it's a very good, comprehensive chapter. And in this lecture, I'm going to try to focus on the most salient things in the chapter. We all would, I think, agree that there are some very serious environmental problems in our country, in our society right now, in the world on the global level. And so one of the questions is, how do we think about those problems and why they exist? And then also, what are some solutions to some of those problems? Um, so we're going to begin by looking at kind of drawing on some of the material from last week. We're going to begin by looking how economists think of environmental problems. And I think these concepts are very useful to think about why, or think about the causes of environmental problems, what causes them, why they exist, and also to help think about some of the potential solutions to preventing them. So economists like to use these two concepts here: collective action failures and negative externalities. And you may recall these two concepts were discussed in the previous chapter, in chapter 4. And these two concepts help us understand how the actions of individuals and firms pursuing their own self-interests in a strategic and rational way within markets generate environmental problems. We talked about, again, how powerful markets can be in allocating society's resources efficiently. But during that process, there's kind of an inherent kind of failing in those market processes that generates environmental problems. So we looked at collective action problems. Now, the word collective action is not necessarily a straightforward term, and you'll see a couple of other concepts discussed in the context of collective action problems. For example, the free rider problem, or in the previous chapter, the prisoner's dilemma. So don't get too confused when all these things are getting thrown at. And we'll focus here on collective action problems. And this just kind of refers to situations where, people are acting on their own self-interests. They're not intending to do harm to anybody, but an outcome is harm to the greater good, or problem to the greater good. So there's a couple of examples given by the authors, and these are examples that I've seen also in economics textbooks. If you have, let's say you have some farming land that is shared, or more than one farmer has access to it. And if all of the farmers that have access to a particular land where their cattle can graze, if everyone lets their cattle graze freely, they're going to use up the food on the land. There'll be quickly no longer enough food for grazing, for the farmer, for the animals to eat. So as the food supply runs out, then you have a collective problem. There needs to be some way of at least allocating that food supply more efficiently, or doing something to account for this problem. Perhaps a clearer example is the depletion of fish in a particular lake, or it could be a river, or it could be a part of the ocean where there's a certain kind of fish that is in high demand. If you allow fishermen to catch as many fish as they want, then you're soon going to run out of fish. And therefore, if it's being used as a recreational activity, there'll be no more fish for other people to enjoy fishing. If it is part of the food supply and people make a business in catching fish, salmon or what have you for the market, you'll soon deplete that food supply also. And then the fish will no longer be able to reproduce and generate more fish or enough fish. So in both of these cases, there's a need for government. There's a need for government planning. When we say government planning, we could say government policy, government action, but there's a need for some kind of government action that helps to regulate how those markets work, so these kinds of problems can be prevented. Another example that was given in the textbook that is an example of a collective action problem was the example of recycling. So there's a great need in our society to recycle because of, we're using our resources so much, and it can benefit the environment by recycling. But the point here in this example was individuals may not have an incentive to recycle. So you don't really get paid for recycling. You don't necessarily see the benefits of recycling. So people might feel like, well, it doesn't really matter how much of an effort I make to also recycle the goods that I'm using, because other people are doing it and I'm not going to make much of a difference. So here there's kind of a sense that there is a need for government action in some way to give people an incentive to recycle or make it easier for them to recycle so they feel like they are contributing. So again, another example of a collective action kind of problem. Okay, let's now turn to the negative externality. We talked a little bit about negative externalities last week, and here's a similar thing. People are pursuing their rational interests in the marketplace, and that marketplace may be working pretty well, but one of the unintended outcomes is a negative effect on somebody else, some other group or some other person that was unintended. And it can be a real problem. So there's some good examples given in a textbook. One of them is the example of the use of nitrogen fertilizer among farmers. And this currently is a major problem in many farming or near many farming communities. So the idea here is that when a farmer uses nitrogen fertilizer, his or her crops are much more productive. He's able to produce much more for the market, and therefore, from the economic point of view, that is a good thing. Now, the problem is that when it rains and when there's other sources of water, there can be runoff, and the nitrogens run off into perhaps a stream, perhaps another river, perhaps somehow into some other community, and that does some negative things. It might pollute a lake that people enjoy going to for recreation. Nitrogen is a toxic chemical that can lead to a number of human health problems, cancers, and children being born with birth defects. So now we go back to the farmer, and the farmer had no idea that this would be a problem. And in fact, the farmer is not responsible for the costs that those nitrogen fertilizers create for society. Now the river has to be cleaned up. Now families are paying more money for medical care, and the farmer is kind of out of the equation. So these are social costs placed on society that that individual in the marketplace is not responsible for. Now, if the farmer was responsible for those costs, he or she would most likely not be using the nitrogen fertilizer. Another good example is acid rain. Power plants generate sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides in the process of generating power. And those chemicals are emitted into the air. This is a real problem in the Midwest, where a lot of, especially older power plants are located. And these plants emit a lot of, especially sulfur dioxide, or sulfur, I should say. And so the sulfur goes into the air and basically kind of blows downwind, and somehow is, kind of stuck up in the clouds, so to speak. It gets absorbed into the air, into the clouds, and into that part of the atmosphere. And when it rains, these chemicals come back down to the Earth's surface. And so it's a major problem in contaminating. So the sulfur dioxides really damage the forests, and also can damage things like if it does rain on or fall on commercial buildings, it can damage the paint and so on. But the main problem, the main damage is to the forests. So the important point here is that the power plants, again, are not responsible for those costs. Those are social costs that society has to deal with, and the power plant doesn't. So if those costs were incurred by the power plant, they may rethink how they go about their business. And so now one more example. Oh, no, those are the two examples I had. So now again, in both of these examples, I think you can see now there's a need for government intervention. There's a need for the government to step in and do something. Now there's a variety of things that the government can do. The main thing, the main policy, the main action that government has taken towards these kinds of problems is direct regulation. And that's basically saying, okay, power plants, you have to reduce the amount of sulfur dioxides that you're emitting into the air. And the way you do that is they have to buy some expensive equipment that can capture those sulfur dioxides before they're emitted into the air. So those are the two main economic concepts that I think are very useful to thinking about environmental problems and helping us think about ways to solve them. Another concept that the authors talk about is NIMBY, or not in my backyard. You may have heard this term, and it's often mentioned in the local media or other places. Maybe you've heard of it from another class. Sometimes people say NIMBYism, but NIMBY basically stands for not in my backyard. This is not really an economic concept. I would say it's more of a sociological concept. And so NIMBY concerns the ways in which political and economic power can be used to displace the costs of environmental problems onto vulnerable groups. And I think this is something that kind of will resonate with many of you, just because we see this happening so often, and particularly on a local level. The problem occurs when a location has to be found for something that people don't want near them. Some examples here: radioactive waste dumps, housing for the homeless, a recycling plant that emits toxic chemicals, and one of the common things we hear about today is, the problem of homelessness, and it's a major challenge, a major problem confronting local cities. And so one of the major impediments to coming up with a solution for the homeless, especially providing them with some housing, but also providing them with other social services, is where do you locate the housing and where do you locate the social services? If you're going to provide job training or any kind of medical services or what have you, you're going to have that somewhere. So nobody wants that near their neighborhoods. I shouldn't say nobody, but there is, most people don't want that problem near them. So this becomes a problem. Now, another kind, in addition, if we think of the homeless, that's one thing. Perhaps another example, and another very common example, is if you have some kind of plant or company that emits toxic chemicals, recycling plant, a power plant, a metal plant. There's a number of different kinds of these companies that emit toxic chemicals. Nobody wants that kind of plant to locate near them or in their neighborhood. So when public authorities make decisions about where to locate such a facility, let's use again the example of a recycling plant that emits a toxic chemical, they are very responsive to pressure from powerful groups and individuals. So decisions about where a company can locate are typically made by cities, and people on the city council, people that work in planning, the mayor, the whole, people that deal with building permits, all those folks are very susceptible to being influenced by people who have power. And when we say power, we're talking about, people who have the time to invest in trying to influence decisions, and people who especially have the wealth that they can use to influence public officials. So it's easier to locate these kinds of facilities in communities where people are poor. And unfortunately, this often means minority communities. And so this is a pattern actually that you see across cities in the United States, where you will have a plant that emits a toxic chemical. The easiest place for it to locate is in a poor community, because it's not going to meet the resistance that it would if they were trying to locate near a wealthy community. There's an interesting statistic I'm going to read from the textbook. In the year 2000, neighborhoods that were located within a 3-mile radius of a hazardous waste facility had a racial composition of 56% non-white. Neighborhoods with further than 3 kilometers from such a facility were 70% white and 30% non-white. And there's a couple of other tables here, these on page 80 and 81, that illustrate how these kinds of facilities are disproportionately located in poor communities. So this is the problem of NIMBYism. So now, in addition to collective action failures, negative externalities, and NIMBY or NIMBYism, another cause of environmental problems has to do with individual wealth and corporate power. Now, this was an issue also with NIMBYism, but it's also recognized on a wider scale. The authors use examples of our energy use in the United States as examples of how individuals and corporations with wealth and power are able to influence markets, and they're able to kind of get their way and advance their economic interests. Obstacles to solving environmental problems may be a result of strategies taken by powerful actors in which they effectively use their power to block solutions. So we can see this, for example, with the problem of climate change. Evidence that climate change or global warming is occurring is overwhelming. And the fossil fuel industry has committed millions and millions of dollars to preventing or discouraging government from taking regulatory action against their industries. A couple of other examples from the textbook that are very useful are corporate opposition to automobile emission standards. So automobiles, of course, are a major problem in terms of contributing to climate change. And they also use a lot of fossil fuels, a finite resource. So there is an incentive, or there should be an incentive to increase the miles per gallon that automobiles can get. And so the automobile industry has resisted these kinds of standards because the most profitable cars to make in many cases have been the large SUVs and the big polluters. And another example is our looking at our sources of energy use. So many people believe that we should be investing in alternative sources of energy, like solar power and the use of wind turbines and some other things. But we continue to predominantly rely on those sources that are based on the use of fossil fuels that generate carbon dioxide and lead to global warming and other problems. And so the argument here is, or the point of this example here is that those who defend our current patterns of heavy use of fossil fuels argue that the market has not really directed us towards solar power and wind and so on. That if those alternative sources of energy were profitable, that is, then the market would direct us to using them more. But the fossil fuel industry, especially coal and so on, has been able to use their wealth and power to influence Congress and to influence government actors at all levels to favor the fossil fuel industry, especially through providing the industry with subsidies in terms of tax breaks, subsidies in terms of financial payments for doing research and development, subsidies in terms of easing regulations on natural pristine lands for energy development. And so the market, therefore, is not really operating in a neutral sense. It's not operating according to the theory in which people enter the market equally and the market directs us to the most beneficial use of our resources. The author has some good statistics here in this chapter as to the amount of money in terms of economic subsidies that has been given to the fossil fuel industry in comparison to solar power and other alternative sources of energy. Here's a nice quote from the chapter. Energy use in the American economy today is not the result of spontaneous, impersonal operation of the market and consumer preferences. Rather, it has been heavily shaped by the strategies of powerful corporations. Okay, so I'm going to end this lecture here as part one, and then I'll have a part two where I'll talk about global warming and climate change.